Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 5th Watershed Recreation Management Planning Community Meeting. We appreciate everyone's time, your ongoing engagement and interest in this topic, and the conversations we've been having with you over the past couple of weeks and months. We've got a good packed agenda for you tonight of a presentation from our consultant team at Alta, who's going to be providing an overview of our watershed census survey, and then we've got our technical professional from Oregon State, Ashley D'Antonio, who's going to work with us on a watershed recreation zoning concept and exercise to get community input on that approach. With that, you can go to the next slide, Brian. So as I mentioned, we'll take a moment to kind of review where we've been and where we're going with the watershed recreation management planning process. We'll hand it over to Alta to start talking about the survey findings that we collected from watershed intercept surveys and some of the data that we've been collecting through trail-based apps. Then we'll go on to a discussion about recreational zoning and a workshop, and then provide some time for some closing thoughts. Just if you need it, we have enabled captions, so you can utilize the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window to enable captions for the evening. Next slide, Brian. And just a reminder to everyone as we start through this planning process, respect competing views. We are all coming with our own background and interests here. Make space for alternative perspectives. Recognize that difference is good. We benefit from having various opinions and perspectives in the world, and really acknowledge that compromise is essential for us to move this forward. And I think we've been having really important conversations with community groups around some of their priorities, and we're taking those priorities seriously and thinking about how we can balance those priorities through this process to have a kind of better condition in the future, and really to steward the resource that you all care so much about, and we do as well. So next slide, Brian. So we won't spend too much time here, but we started this process almost 10 months ago. We initiated it even before that with an initial scoping phase to get input on what folks wanted to see in this process. We've worked through collecting information on issues that folks were seeing on the watershed. We took time to work through project goals and objectives. We gave an overview of the data collection efforts that we'd be embarking on, and that's what we're really presenting here tonight. And then we took time to talk about stewardship and how we can all engage better with the mountain and take care of it. We moved on with our last meeting to talk about recreational facilities. And now we're going to be presenting some of that data collection to you this evening, and then talking more specifically about an important management strategy that we see, which is recreation management zoning. And then the next meeting, we'll take time to talk about adaptive management and start developing outcomes and recommendations for this planning process. We've also had site visits to connect folks with projects that are ongoing and to give an overview of some of the programs that the district already runs. And then we have our project website up, so all of these meetings are being hosted there and can be reviewed at your convenience. And then we've been working through the watershed visitor census survey, as I mentioned. So with that, I'm going to hand it over. Oh, I'll just mention we will be doing an update at the watershed committee meeting next month. That's the third Thursday of the month, about this planning process, and as well about other watershed initiatives that are moving forward. And then we'll be working towards an April meeting where we'll be coming back to you all with a process for collecting input on some of the outcomes that you would like to see through this process. And then we'll be working from there for the next couple of months to really bring this planning document into a physical form, doing some writing, reviewing, and development, and continuing to provide updates at the watershed committees periodically. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alta, and they're going to dive into some of the results that we've collected and analyzed through our watershed visitor census survey, and compare that to some of our findings from the 2013 report that we developed as well. Over to you, Brian.
All right, thanks, Sean. So yeah, we're excited to share a look at the data that came out of the surveys we collected this fall. So hopefully some of you, or a lot of you, were able to participate in the survey. We had an online version and an in-person version where a mix of Marin Water staff and other volunteers and members of the consultant team were out on site collecting surveys. We had over 220 staff hours out there on site doing these surveys and collected over 1,000 responses. So 1,060 responses to be more precise. For the purposes of tonight's meeting, we're going to be focused on the in-person survey, primarily because the in-person survey is a direct comparison to what was done in 2012. So we can look at the data in more of an apples to apples comparison. So the surveys were conducted, as I said, in the fall between August 29th and October 25th at select trailheads and other popular locations along the watershed. It featured 12 days of survey collection, and within those 12 days, surveys were collected at a variety of times in order to gather input from a wide range of users who use the site. Some use it during the week in the morning, some use it on the weekends in the afternoon. So we had folks out there in the mornings between 7 and 11, in the afternoon between 11 and 1, and in the late afternoon and evening between 3 and 6. On the next several slides, we're going to be going through a lot of data. So I just want to remind everyone that all of this information will be posted on the project website following this meeting if you want to take a deeper dive into the survey results. And then the survey results, both the online versions and the in-person results, will be part of the Marin Rec plan as an attachment to the overall report. So you'll see it again there too when that's published. So to begin, the first finding, respondents were slightly older in 2022 versus 2012. A little help reading these graphs. The blue bars is the 22 survey results, and the silver or gray bars is the data that was collected in 2012. So you see a slightly general trend that the ages were slightly older in 2022. Next, the visitation frequency, the duration, the typical times people were out using the watershed were very similar. We found the results to be very similar between 2022 and 2012. Over 1/3 of the folks visiting the watershed are out there on a weekly basis. The second most popular response were people who use the site monthly. And then we have nearly 20% of respondents use the site daily, which was really exciting to see that there's a lot of people out there almost every day. The mode of arrival, or how people are getting to the watershed, has stayed relatively equal between 2022 and 2012. The one slight difference being that a few folks are arriving via e-bike, and e-bikes weren't really around or being used at all in 2012. So that's why you see that jump under the e-bike category. We'll also note that there's still about 60% of people arriving by car. 14% of users are walking to the site to access the watershed, and 21% are arriving by bicycle. Now, the primary activities within the watershed are very similar, again, between 2022 and 2012, with the exception being the e-biking, because again, that wasn't really a category we were tracking in 2012. We did see some increases in hiking and dog walking as well. So respondents being on the watershed to hike increased from 36% to 41% between 2012 and 2022. Levels of running, biking, picnicking, fishing stayed relatively flat. There was a decrease in respondents saying they were there to enjoy nature. Perhaps they decided to consider that their primary reason for visiting fell into one of those other categories, other than out there solely to enjoy nature. We also found that the visitor experiences on the watershed continue to be generally good. We have the parking and restroom availability were rated as poor by the largest portion of respondents, and that was still a relatively small number, 7% responding that they found the parking facilities to be poor, and 5% reporting that they found the restroom facilities to be poor. But the majority of responses, even on the parking and restrooms, came back as positive.
Hey, Brian. Could you adjust your camera or delete your name a little bit? I think we have some participants trying to read lips a bit when you're talking, so that would be helpful.
Oh, sure. I'll sit up for these last few slides. Thanks, Sean. In addition, we found that trail conditions were rated as great or good by a large majority of respondents. 87% of the responses came back ranking the trail conditions as either great or good. Likewise with the fire road conditions, slightly lower, but responses still came back with 84% in the great or good category. On the flip side to that, trails were rated fair or poor by just 4% of respondents, and fire roads were rated fair or poor by 6% of the respondents. And then safety on the watershed, or user safety, feeling safe. Majority of the respondents reported feeling safe when visiting, 91%, whereas just 1% reported feeling unsafe between similar both in 2012 and 2022. The same percentage of respondents there feeling unsafe, and 8% did not answer that question in 2022, which is better than the results we got in 2012, where 40% didn't end up answering that question. So we got, I think, a better view at 91% of the people feeling safe while they're on the watershed. And I'll turn it over to Cole with Alta to speak a bit more about our survey results.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Another aspect of being out on the watershed is using a map and kind of the signs that are out there to navigate around. We see that has actually improved pretty well over the past decade. In 2012, we saw that it was rated as great by about 20% and good by about 44%. It got rated at 32% by as great, which is a pretty strong increase over the past decade. And then looking at the interactions between visitors, those remain generally the same, falling in the good and great category, and mirroring very similarly to what we identified in 2012, a decade ago. Next slide. Now, looking at e-bikes and their access onto the watershed, we asked kind of what strategy would you support as far as Class 1 access on the watershed. And you can see those three gray bars in the middle represent about 63% of respondents that said that they would allow for e-bikes on the watershed with some form of permit, either no permit, a permit, or a paid permit of some kind. There was also about 12% of respondents who indicated that they would allow for e-bikes, but for only ADA uses, so very focused use type there. And then a quarter of respondents indicated that restricting e-bikes on and their access to the watershed would be the most palatable for them. Next slide. Now, looking at the trail management strategies that we could carry forward, we brought forward 4 and asked for respondents to rank those comparatively. You can see that the graph on the right shows how that breaks down, with the first choice and second choice being selected the most for the creation of multi-use trail connections in order to separate visitors in those high-use areas. We see that was selected as either the first or second choice by about 63%, or about 2/3 of respondents. Comparatively, on the other side, the establishment of a reservation parking system for high-use trailheads in order to reduce some visitor impacts was selected as the last choice by 50% of respondents. So certainly the least attractive option of those management strategies there. Next slide. Now, we also had kind of a mapping function to this survey where we asked people to identify their typical entrance and exits, as well as destinations and congested areas. Here you're seeing the entrance and exits in the exterior of the park. You can see on mostly the eastern side, kind of southeastern side, getting the majority of responses for where people are entering and exiting the district. And then if you go to the next slide, we can see where then people are ending up, where their kind of destinations are. And we can see that a lot of these are centered around the some of the most popular picnic destinations around Lake Lagunitas and the East Peak picnic area. Certainly, probably no surprise for people who frequent the district here. We also asked respondents to identify the most congested areas that they have come across in their time. If you go one slide, yep, here we go. So you'll see these shown in that similar heat map in yellow. These highlight the two areas, the couple of areas that were identified as the most congested by respondents. Now, what we did was compared this with data from Strava. Strava is an app that allows you to record a recreational activity, typically a hike or a bike ride, and then track a whole bunch of time splits and the like. But what we care about is adding all of those together and identifying what the trails are that have the highest amount of usage. So we were able to grab that data, aggregate it together, and identify the trails that have the highest amount of use and potential for some conflict, just based on the overall amount of use. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see kind of a different breakdown and representation of that data and breaking it out by the different modes of travel. So you can see here, bicycle trips are represented in blue, with a darker blue representing a higher number of trips throughout a day. Pedestrian or hiking trips are represented in kind of a pink or red, with a darker red representing a higher number of trips. Where you see a pink or a blue, that is one mode specifically kind of having the majority of use on that trail. But where we see overlap and you see purple, such as near Phoenix Lake, that is an area where there is some overlap between the modes and a significant amount of use. As you can see, it's very dark. So this is one of the going to be a key input that we'll use working forward in our zoning discussion. But I'll put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I wanted to talk about the annual estimate that we also developed as part of this. What we were able to do with the Strava data, beyond identifying the specific trails that have the highest amount of use, was extrapolate to the total amount of annual usage. We did this by placing eco counters throughout the district at select trails and fire roads throughout. Now, these eco counters enable us to passively collect usage data and count the number of hikers and bikers who pass by a specific point on a trail. These were out there for August through November, so it allowed us to capture a couple of months of data throughout every single day of those periods, and then compare that with our Strava data that identified an amount of usage throughout every trail and fire road in the district. With that, we extrapolated that out to the annual estimate and compared that to the estimate from the year prior, or the decade prior, I'm sorry, the survey that we did previously. Brian, if you could bring that up. So we see that using that methodology, we were able to develop a range of the total usage and total amount of people visiting the district in a low and high fashion. Now, comparing that to the value from 2012, the 2012 estimate was about 1.8 million visitors per year. You can see that This estimate indicates that usage has increased anywhere from 9% to about 46% in total usage. So there's certainly more people using the district and the trails than there were a decade prior. Thank you. Now, with that, we're able to start sifting through the data and compiling data on top of each other. The next step with the data analysis will be identifying kind of the intersection between the overall visitor usage and what our valuable resource data indicates, from biological, ecological, water quality data, as well as cultural resources. We'll compare or add these on top of each other, basically to help identify potential recreation and preservation zones. But I'm going to actually pass it to expert to talk about how this layering would happen, how it's used kind of around the area. So I'll pass that off to Ashley to take it from there.
Ashley, 1 minute before you go on, we had a couple questions just to clarify around the survey. The surveys were taken during the weekend, during the mornings and the evenings and the afternoons. They were conducted. We do have restrooms. They are portable restrooms. They're throughout the watershed. Congestion was relative to other areas of the watershed. So where we had the most use and the most visitation, the most people coming in, those were the areas that were shown in the heat map. And in response to every major entrance to the watershed is where the surveys were occurring. So anybody that coming into the watershed was captured in those surveys. And then, yes, the in-person survey will be compared to the online survey in the report when it comes out. And with that, we're not going to keep going through questions right now, but we just wanted to clarify those points at this time. And I'll hand it over to Ashley. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm Dr. Ashley D'Antonio. I'm an associate professor of nature-based recreation management at Oregon State University. My specialty is in recreation ecology, but also visitor use planning and recreation management broadly. So you can go to the next slide, Brian. Here's kind of what I'm going to walk through tonight. So Cole kind of wrapped up Alta's section talking about how we're going to combine a bunch of different data to start considering potential recreation and preservation zones. So we thought it'd be useful for me to come in and talk a little bit about the history of recreation zoning and how we think about zones in outdoor recreation settings, talking about it as a management tool, examples of different zoning. And then about halfway through, we're going to pause for an interactive component where we can start to think about the questions we ask when we're trying to figure out how to determine what those recreation zones might be and where they might be on a landscape. And then briefly at the end, kind of leading into what the next meeting will be on, to talk about adaptive management and zoning. You can go to the next slide, thanks. So a little bit of history, a little history lesson here. So this idea of zoning as a tool for outdoor recreation management really started to become popular and something that was in heavy discussion in the 1970s. And it was during this time period that the U.S. Forest Service came up with a management framework, a planning framework called the Recreation Opportunity Spectrum. And it's also called the ROS, so I'll use that acronym through the next couple of slides. The ROS was really a way to think about how managerial settings like trails, park facilities are on a landscape and how those interact with the types of social settings and social opportunities that visitors might be seeking, as well as those environmental settings. And what the recreation opportunity spectrum really got us thinking about from a recreation management standpoint is that the intersection of these three aspects can really help us provide quality recreation experiences to visitors while also meeting other management and environmental goals. I'll go on to the next slide. So some of the basic principles of the recreation opportunity spectrum is that we can use zoning. We can use the zoning tool to create these different recreation opportunities on a landscape. And one of the basic principles is that if we apply the zoning thoughtfully, we can provide a variety of diverse opportunities within the same landscape and have opportunities that can coexist with other management objectives and ecological objectives. So the goals of the ROS, like if you look back in the early documents from it, was really to provide visitors with opportunities to engage in the activities that they were seeking by thinking about what is the appropriate physical, social, and in here physical, they really meant like ecological. Again, in this early 1970s language, what they were talking about was like ecological environment, the appropriate ecological environment, social environment, and managerial environment. And that by, again, thinking about these things, we can help visitors achieve their motivations for recreating and help them get the benefits that they're seeking. And so again, I keep coming back to this because it's gonna be really important, but it was 3 aspects that the ROS thought about. And these are common aspects that we think about when we're identifying recreation zones. So again, the natural physical setting, the social setting, the managerial setting. I have one more animation, sorry, Brian. And when you combine these, again, you're creating opportunities for different experiences on the landscape. And so these basic principles that I've covered from the 1970s are really what set us up for thinking about recreation zones and thinking about these 3 aspects, environment, social, and managerial, for again, hoping to create opportunities for visitors. These are the classic ROS zones that came out in the 1970s. I'm just giving them as examples. There's lots of different ways you can think about the type of zones that you might have in a recreation setting, but this is kind of what the Forest Service came up with, and this gives us a place to start. So the classic ROS zones or classes went all the way from like a primitive zone where you were having managing for opportunities for solitude, managing maybe for more conservation goals, having less managerial infrastructure, all the way up to more developed, what we might consider like a front country area where we have a trailhead, we have parking lots, where maybe you're managing for social experiences where visitors can engage with each other. And so these zones that the Forest Service came up with were kind of on this spectrum from primitive all the way to urban and developed. Again, this is how we started thinking about it early on in recreation science. You can go to the next slide. This is just a visual that the Forest Service uses, again, to highlight this, that again, at on the left, where that P is, that's our primitive zone, where if we're thinking about the social environment, we might be managing for more solitude, where in that more urban or more front country type of environment, we're really thinking about opportunities for socializing, for example. And then across these zones, you'd also have goals and objectives around the ecological environment and the managerial environment. And we've updated this a little bit in recreation science. This is a guide about sustainable tourism and recreation that came out in 2018. And this is kind of, again, showing how we can kind of update the ROS a little bit by thinking about from a wildlife standpoint, if that's an ecological condition we're thinking of managing for across zones, we can have locations where, again, making sure wildlife are present is important. And the other side, again, you might have, in this case, we're thinking about like tourism settings, right? Maybe there are domestic animals that are integrated there, or maybe our conservation goals are not as strict in those locations. Again, it varies depending upon the type of protected area you're managing in. I've hit this experiential or social condition a few times now, right? We can think about opportunities for solitude versus opportunities for socializing. And then again, from the managerial perspective, we're thinking about like, what are the facilities that the managers are providing? What are the conditions of trails? How much maintenance is there? Those sorts of conditions. Next slide. This again was developed, this idea of using recreational zones was developed by the Forest Service, but Parks Canada adopted this framework. They don't call it the ROS, they call it the 5-zone system. These are their 5 zones, and they have to address these zones in all of their recreation management plans. And Parks Canada actually came back to the zoning framework a couple of years ago and said, hey, is this still working? Do we still want to make this a core part of our management plans, applying this zoning onto our parks? And they decided that, yeah, it was working really well, and they're still using this sort of zoning framework in all of their park recreation management plans. So the ROS really started in the 70s as a planning framework, as a way, again, to like go about recreation planning. We have more updated planning frameworks that are used by various agencies and land managers today. So we don't really talk about ROS anymore as a planning framework. We more talk about it as a tool, as a management tool that we can use to, again, meet our management objectives. So there was your little history lesson about the ROS. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about like examples of zoning, what it can look like, and then I'll move into like, okay, well, how do we make these management zoning decisions? So first off, I wanted to emphasize that zoning as a visitor use management tool is incredibly common. I went to some of the most recent literature to kind of check myself to make sure this was still the case. And all of it agrees that zoning is a commonly used management tool for recreation use because it can both address social and ecological concerns very effectively. And generally across the board, it is a management action that typically has strong support from visitors, that they see that it's effective on the landscape and that it helps, again, to provide social opportunities, often while meeting those conservation or ecological goals. And again, because I'm an academic, I have to cite everything. The most recent textbook on recreation management just came out in the fall, and they said same thing, common tool, people support it. So this is still showing up in the most current studies around zoning. And there are different types of zoning. So I'm going to go through the kind of a few different examples of what zoning can look like. And then I'll be talking at you for a while. So we'll do a little interaction after this section. So the first example we're going to go through is spatial zoning. And I know my image here is a marine protected area and the watershed is terrestrial, but marine protected areas use zoning a lot use spatial zoning a lot because it is incredibly effective. And a lot of our marine protected areas have very strong kind of conservation goals, very strong like managerial objectives. And so it's very, very common for marine protected areas to use spatial zoning because of its effectiveness. Go to the next slide. Another example of kind of a trail-based spatial zoning is one protected area close to me here in Oregon that I wanted to bring in as an example. So this is just a chunk of a map of a local forest here in Corvallis, Oregon, where I'm located, is our research forest, and they have a zoned trail system. So you can see that the trails that are in red, these are their multi-use trails. So these allow year-round hiking, biking, and equestrian use. Then we have some trails that have been optimized for mountain biking. So they're providing very much like a mountain biking experience, and those trails in this map are showed in purple. Those are not open to hikers and not open to equestrian use. Again, they're optimized for mountain biking experiences. Then we have a little bit of a combination of spatial zoning, and then the next type of zoning I'll talk about, temporal zoning. The trails, which there aren't any on this section of the map, but on other sections of the map, we have some trails that are highlighted in a more like orange color. Those trails are open to both hiking and biking during the dry months, but during the wet season here in Oregon right now, they're closed to biking, and if they get wet enough, closed to hiking. So we can, again, separate out our uses to optimize the experiences that visitors are seeking, and then also use some zoning to protect our natural resources. And then we also highlight some places where the research force is hoping to build future trails to create new opportunities for visitors and where that might be appropriate. And there's already some zoning going on at the watershed. These are images that I took from the Road and Trail Management Plan to kind of just highlight how this is already happening here in some places. So this is the overall map. In a couple of slides, we'll kind of zoom in onto the Pilot Knob area, but we can go to the next slide, Brian. So I just talked about the different types of zone trails that we have here in the research forest at Oregon State, but there's already a similar class of trails on the watershed. And so again, I pulled this right from the Roads and Trails Management Plan, but this is showing that there's different trail classes. And if you look at the characteristics, you can even pull out some of those social, managerial, and ecological factors that go into determining a zone. So for example, for class, what would that be, 8? The moderate use hiking trails, I should have looked at that closer. The moderate use hiking trails, right? One of the managerial conditions that's highlighted is that there's little or no trail infrastructure in that class, that it's hiking only, that there's going to be medium to low use levels. So that's giving us a sense of kind of the social conditions that are being managed there. And again, seasonal closures might apply, and that could be associated with ecological protection. So there's already some of this zoning going on the watershed already within the existing road and trail management plan. You can go to the next slide. And so this is one of the maps that I pulled out. Again, this is the Pilot Knob map, just as an example And I know you probably cannot read the legend, so I will point out what the different trails are. So the trails that you're seeing that are kind of that burnt orange color, those are hiking and equestrian trails. So we're seeing a multi-use type of zoning. The trails that are in like that pinkish red color, those are hiking trails. And when we think about social conditions, those are our higher use trails. And then the kind of greenish brown, I don't really know what color to call it, the greenish brown trails, those are hiking trails that have lower use. So again, our social conditions we might be managing for are different than some of the other trails. You can go to the next slide. And again, pulling in some other examples that I think are relevant to note, I did want to bring in Catskills Park in New York State. I know that seems far away, but Catskills Park provides, that watershed provides some of the drinking water for the city of New York. So actually, when I was an undergrad, I did some water quality studies here to make sure that the water quality was meeting drinking water standards. But because of that, because Catskill Park has this water quality part of their mission and part of their objectives, they have a zoning structure on their landscape as well. And it's highlighted in that little green box, which I can't read. So if you hit the slide, thanks, Brian, we can see what some of these zones are. So they have a wilderness zone. And again, these are zones where they're really trying to prioritize some of that environmental protection. And so it's foot traffic only. They are managing for opportunities for solitude. They don't allow motor vehicles or bicycles in that zone. But then they are providing areas where folks can engage in motorized recreation, equestrian use in their wild forest zone. And then they have a state recreation area zone where they actually have some, I would say like maybe more intensive development. They have a ski center, and that's okay. That's still meeting with their mission and their objectives in that specific zone. So again, using these zoning structures to provide a spectrum of opportunities while thinking about your management objectives and your ecological and conservation goals. Sometimes we'll also see buffer zones that are applied in recreation planning. So in this case, this is a national park in China, but it had the best illustration I could find with what a buffer zone could look like. So that really dark green, those are areas where we're prioritizing the protection of habitat for pandas in this park. And I do want to allow visitor use and infrastructure within here. And so in that very light, what they're calling experimental, but the very light area, that's where most of the visitor use, most of the tourism, most of the activity is occurring. And so in this zoning system, they've created a buffer in that kind of middle green color, kind of buffering the intensive recreation and tourism use from those areas where they're really having habitat conservation as the primary objective. So there is a little bit of visitor use in that dark green, but they're providing this buffer zone within that to kind of temper those potential impacts. You can go to the next slide. Okay. So the next type of zoning is temporal zoning, and temporal zoning is already occurring in the watershed as well. This is the classic example of temporal zoning is when parks or protected areas are only open during daylight hours. So the map I showed from our local research forest, that it's only open during daylight hours. This is kind of a different way to think about temporal zoning. This is from Dana Point Preserve, and they have for conservation protection of some sensitive bird species, actually. They have had this temporal zoning where only certain days of the week it's open, and again, only during daylight hours. So that's just an example. But again, the idea of having a park protected area only open during daylight hours is classically used across a lot of different places. So those were some examples. Again, I pulled from a bunch of different places just to illustrate a few different ways you can think about applying spatial and temporal zoning across landscapes and how you might incorporate some buffer zones. So when we're thinking about like, okay, want to use zoning as a management tool, if we've made that decision, if that's the tool that we think is going to be most effective, like how do we figure out what to consider when we're zoning and like how to put those zones out on the landscape? And so these three questions that I have up here are questions that managers will often ask themselves. And then after this, we'll kind of dig into some other potential questions that we can consider and have a little bit of an interactive piece. So One of the things that managers want to think about is, again, what is appropriate within each zone based on the social, ecological, and managerial objectives for those zones. So again, that's going to vary, right? If folks are familiar with federally designated wilderness, for example, in national forests, those are much different objectives than in non-wilderness areas. So that's, again, another classic example of zoning. So we want to think about that. What are our objectives and how do they vary across the potential zones? Then we want to think about existing conditions. So these might be things like, where are sensitive species? Where are soils that we know might erode? Where are the opportunities where we want visitors to engage with each other versus where folks might be seeking solitude? And then existing managerial conditions, which can be as simple as like, where are trails already? Where are our roads? And understanding that can be informative for making zoning decisions. And then lastly, again, like, what are the visitor opportunities that are appropriate for each zone, and how are we thinking about that? So we can go to the next slide, and then I think we're ready for our interactive piece. Okay, so I've been throwing a lot of kind of like history and academic stuff at you, but we're going to start shifting towards, again, how do we think about how we make these zoning decisions? And we want to have a little interactive piece here. So Cole has put a link into the chat. If you click on this link, it should open up this web page that we're going to see in a second. This is an interactive like post-it note board. Some of you maybe have done in-person meetings where you write your things on a post-it and you stick it up on the board. Same thing, but in a virtual environment. So we're going to start with this blue column. What I want you to do is I want you to think about what social conditions should be considered on the watershed when we're thinking about zoning. And the way you can put your idea up here is you can click on one of the existing little stickies, those white boxes, and type into them. You can grab one from the left-hand side where Alta's kind of stacked them up for you. You could copy and paste one of those and type into it. And I believe there's one other option. You can hit N and open another one. Yep. And so what I want you to do is start to, again, just social conditions. We're going to talk about ecological and managerial later. But to start thinking about the social conditions you would think about with zoning. Is there anything you want to add there, Sean, or anything I've missed?
No, that's great. And right, we're doing this because we're trying to get input, and we're taking the time to allow you all to provide guidance and how you would think about zoning on the watershed, right? We really are here to try to balance the priorities that people are bringing forward. And we've been listening to those kind of issues that you want addressed and those desired conditions you want us to plan towards. So this is your opportunity to start shaping how we think about balancing access and protecting our resources through thinking about zoning for the watershed to help us get somewhere better in the future.
And I am not gonna we might just have a few minutes of silence here while you all put your ideas up there. If we fill up the blue at the top box, you can move down to the next one and put some down there. And then after a couple minutes, we'll move in to start thinking about the ecological conditions. But I want to give you all time to think about this, put up your ideas. And then after a couple of minutes of folks putting ideas up there, we'll kind of shift to the next one. So hopefully folks are comfortable with a little bit of awkward silence for a minute, and give me a second to drink some tea.
Yeah, and just a reminder for folks, you just copy that link into your browser, and then you'll be able to click on the Post-it notes on the left-hand side and populate them with your thoughts.
And there are a lot of people grabbing those. So you can also hit, if you just hit N, it'll pop up a new Post-it note. You can even pick a snazzy color if you are so inclined, and add it that way if you're running out of sticky notes on the far side.
And then we're going to take this, we'll take screenshots of it, we'll integrate it into the final report so you can all see the input. We'll bring it forward in the next meeting so you can all kind of see how folks were thinking about it and how it's shaping our next steps. So all of this is kind of leading into our next meeting, and you're all providing important input. So we appreciate your time.
Is it okay if I quickly address a question in the chat that I think is relevant while folks are
doing
that?
Totally.
Okay. So it's a question from Linda about at our local forest here, the McDonald Dunn, that I gave an example for about compliance with our rules and what kind of staff we have. There is actually very high compliance. We don't have compliance issues is not an issue. And a former graduate student of mine is actually the recreation manager there, so she'd be telling me if there were compliance issues. Compliance is not an issue that we have. And in terms of the tools and ranger staff, it's actually student employees that are on the ground eyes there. And so it's a fairly small staff. I mean, this is a research forest, and the zoning on our research forest has high compliance, and we have very low conflict and very little I don't know, overall support for the way we zone our trails. That's not one of the issues we typically have on our forest. Great question.
Cole, can you paste the link in there again for folks?
I'm still seeing a lot of activity on the board, so we'll give it another couple minutes before we move on to the ecological conditions.
And as people are still working on it here, I would ask if some of the people who have some rather sizable sticky notes, maybe shrink those down a little bit. We do have a lot of space here. I've tried to add some similar boxes kind of down at the bottom if you want to kind of just move them there. But I know there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
We move on to the ecological ones to move to a more open spot for now.
Yeah, that sounds good, Ashley.
Okay. And so if you have other thoughts on the social conditions, I can see folks have already added some ecological. You can go in and add them. We'll stay up through the end of the meeting. So in the green spaces, and I see some of you have already done that, I want you to put sticky notes where you're thinking about, again, what ecological conditions should be considered in zoning. So we've already seen some ecological topic areas that are put through here. And again, so keeping in the green your ecologically themed conditions to consider in zoning. And I believe after this, Alta is going to go through and these, be organized and into themes and those sorts of things. So
Yeah, we'll clean this up for everybody.
Yeah, and it's helpful too is if you can add it onto if it's an ecological one, if it's a social one, managerial. I know can size those. So hopefully you can size it right and get it on there. I'll try and keep adding some sections for you to add those there.
And I'll just note, if you are having trouble with the technology, it's okay. There will be a time at the end where we'll have kind of closing thoughts, and you can, toss out your concepts for the board, and we'll take notes and integrate them. So apologies if this exercise is a bit confusing for folks, but you'll have an opportunity that you can voice your ideas at the end as well.
So give
And
another.
apologies
Go ahead,
for
Paul.
those. Oh, apologies for those trying to do this on mobile. I recognize that might be a struggle, so apologies if there's some functionality issues with that.
Okay, I think we'll give it another minute or so on the ecological side, and then we'll move on to kind of the next stack on the managerial side. So about another minute, and again, this will stay up if you want to keep adding while I'm talking about how this information can be incorporated into zoning. You can continue to add ideas, but I'll move on to the next prompt in about a minute.
And for everyone's benefit, we don't have presentations after this, so we'll be kind of summarizing the input we got from everyone, talk about the zoning as a closing thought, and then we'll move on to getting kind of closing thoughts from all of you. So there'll be plenty of time.
So can you walk through how to add a sticky note again, since some folks have asked that in the chat, just as one more review?
Yeah, definitely. So you can, on your keyboard, just hit the button N, and it will bring up a menu on the left-hand side that you can select a sticky note color and a sticky note, and then just add from there. Or you can copy and paste, although I think my little collection of sticky notes has been pretty well cannibalized here.
Okay, again, you can keep adding social and ecological ideas as they come to you, but we're going to move on to kind of the pink column. And here, I want you to put some of those managerial considerations that should be considered. So things that I mentioned before, things like maybe existing trails that are there, or a level of infrastructure, level of maintenance, or staffing. So the managerial conditions that could help you think about those zoning considerations.
If you can, try to keep your sticky notes small. I know it's a little funky technology, but the big ones definitely don't allow everyone to see the input.
Yeah, I apologize. If you're on mobile, you might need to kind of zoom in and scroll in pretty far, what feels like pretty far, to the level that the rest of the sticky notes are on.
Okay, I'll probably give another 2 minutes or so, then go back to the presentation. So again, we're focusing on the managerial question right now. But if you've had thoughts on the other ones, just make sure sticky is close to the question.
All right, I think that we've gotten a lot of good input from folks, and maybe we'll call if you can, and if folks want to just stop inputting for a minute, we'll just review them all collectively really quick, and that way folks can see kind of the ideas that were put in. So we'll zoom out and go start with our social one and see if we can give folks a little bit of insight into what others were thinking in regards to that. We'll just take a minute or two when we go through that. Looks like we got some massive stickies that took over the board, and we apologize to everyone, and thanks for bearing with like trying to get input in new ways and using new technology. It's not meaning to be frustrating to any of you, but we appreciate that maybe it was a little bit, and we'll try our best to summarize this input, and at the April meeting we can bring back kind of a summary of what folks provided input on and how we can use that to kind of create a decision-making model for informing kind of the development of recreational zones. And the intention here really truly is to help us balance, right? We can't all agree on what actions should be taken, but if we can agree on the important priorities and understand that folks have different perspectives, and maybe we can kind of bring some alignment in our thinking around how to achieve both outcomes or all outcomes for the benefit of the community. So, right, we started with the social question and got a lot of kind of equal access, increase, more access for bikes, mountain bike optimized, right? More trails, better parking. I think that's a real struggle. It's difficult to develop more parking, but it's a great point. Cycling on trails, yes. Equitable access for bikes, infrastructure to prevent illegal parking. That's a major issue for us. Yeah, Alpine Dam specifically is a big one. And as I mentioned, it's a little hard if people post the big ones over us when we're trying to summarize them. So this might be better just brought back to the next meeting, and we'll kind of consolidate this into a kind of logical understanding so you can see what folks put into it, and we don't kind of spend too much time reading the same post-it notes or getting disrupted by additional add-ons. So we do appreciate everyone's input and just taking the time to think through this. It's an important step, and it is helpful. So we can't, right now be in a large room where we get all this input into a board where we then summarize it. So this is very helpful for our planning process to get your thoughts, and then we start to integrate it into the planning effort. So with that, I'll hand it back to Ashley, and you can kind of close out the zoning, and then we'll go on to our input from all of you.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Sean. Yeah, so again, those are the questions to be considered about how to think about putting zones in the landscape. And the last little bit of my presentation is going to talk about a couple other examples of how other planning processes have taken, the kind of information you've all provided and other information that's out there and put it into some recreation suitability mapping or some recreation zoning. So one of the ways you can think about this, and this is just an over technical term for talking about almost essentially that great kind of sieve figure that Cole presented on the last slide. How do we think about the different criteria that we're looking at in a park and protected area? And so this was a study in 2008 that took basically set up a criteria of looking at, on the left-hand side, we see some of the ecological criteria that we're considering and created a map of ecological resources. Then in the middle, we have some of these kind of social or cultural. They had some cultural resources here and created a map of where those were located. And on the right-hand side of this flow diagram, we're looking at, again, that infrastructure. Where are the trails? What are the recreational activities? And created a map of those. And then combine them and using their multiple objectives across zones, figured out what areas are most appropriate for what zones. You can go to the next slide. We can also use survey methods or other methods to kind of understand recreational preferences or recreation suitability. And so again, we've seen some maps very similar to this already this evening, right? Cole presented some Strava maps and some other maps of public participatory GIS where folks said where they're accessing places, where they're exiting, their destinations. That sort of data can be built into kind of a social conditions map to show us, where are folks going, where are their preferences, and use that as an input into our zones. So some of this data that was presented earlier today is really rich for informing these zoning decisions. And again, we can ask visitors about where they're experiencing different social conditions on the landscape. So this was a study that was done in Grand Teton National Park, but we'd ask people, hey, where do you want to find improved social bonding? Where do you want to connect with other people? Where do you want to have a sense of adventure? And folks pointed to a map of where these locations were. And we're able to take that information and consider that in those social conditions in our zone as well. And we can also look at where there might be things to maybe not be concerned about, to consider, right? We saw on those maps some hotspots of potential congestion. This was, again, another similar exercise where we asked people, where did you experience crowding? Where did you observe resource damage? Where did you experience conflict? And so we're able to use information from folks or pulling in other data sources that we can map and highlighting where these conditions are on the landscape to help inform that social condition aspect of the zoning considerations. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is just recreation susceptibility mapping, using an example from a study that I conducted, how we can think about pulling in ecological data into our zoning decisions. You can go to the next slide. So we're going to quickly, for a few minutes, travel together to Yosemite National Park, not too far. And this was a project that was looking at a small scale, the scale of a meadow, but the principle can be applied to any park and protected area at larger spatial scales, to look at the interface between where visitor use was occurring and where our sensitive ecological resources were. So these maps that I'm showing here, they're density maps. They're where visitors were going at El Cap Meadow in Yosemite National Park. So the darker the red, the more visitors there were in that area. The lighter the blue, the fewer visitors. And this was for 2 different seasons. This was from like busy summer season and then a shoulder season, kind of like in the fall. So we can look at this across different temporal scales. And these maps should look very similar to the maps that Strava data can pull out. We can see similar heat maps. You could use, eco counter data to help inform this, but there's lots of ways to get at this kind of social condition map. And really what Yosemite wanted me to help with their kind of small scale zoning on this meadow was to understand the relationship between where visitors were going and the sensitive vegetation that they were concerned about. So this is a map of vegetation communities in El Cap Meadow and how sensitive or susceptible they are to recreation use. The recreation ecology term we use is resistance. So high resistant plant communities are ones that you can have more recreation use without seeing high levels of disturbance. So these are very resistant to disturbance, typically like grasses and stuff that bend and don't break and kind of hard to damage. Then we had areas of very low resistant vegetation communities. And so these where there's potentially species that were of concern for the park or plant species that maybe we knew would be more susceptible to disturbance from recreation. And so, if you're thinking about, where those plants are on the watershed, there might be areas that might have more sensitive plant species than others, or you can think about soils, right? There might be places where there's soils that might be more susceptible to recreation disturbance than others. You can map these and have a map that shows which ecological resources might be more susceptible to recreation disturbance. You can go to the next slide. So what I did for Yosemite to help them figure out their management actions here was to combine, sorry, I have a fancy animation in here, Brian, if you can hit it one more time. To combine these 2 data layers, we overlaid our visitor use map with our vegetation susceptibility map. And in the end, one more animation, we were able to highlight areas of potential ecological change. So if we go to the next slide, this is the maps that I ultimately gave Yosemite, where I said, okay, based on where your sensitive ecological resources are and based on where we're finding high and low visitor use, these are the locations in dark orange where the ecosystem might be more susceptible to recreation disturbance. We might see more disturbance from recreation change. And the areas that are that light yellow color were areas where, because of the combination between recreation use and vegetation, there was kind of less potential for disturbance. So ultimately, and I should have put in some photos of this, ultimately what Yosemite did, if you've been to El Cap Meadow, they fenced off a large chunk of the meadow and kind of forced visitors into a zone that had low potential for change. So kept visitors away from those areas that have really that dark orange. So they're trying to encourage visitors into a zone that had less susceptible vegetation and at visitor use levels that we could, again, meet our ecological objectives while still providing opportunities for visitors to visit this meadow and engage with recreational activities like watching climbers in El Cap, taking photographs, or some picnicking that happens here. So again, this is a small scale. This is just a meadow, but the principles that I've been presenting can be scaled up to entire parks and protected areas. And actually, a graduate student of mine is doing the same approach for all the protected areas in Orange County to help them start to think about recreation management and recreation zoning on some of their landscapes. So again, this is an example at a small area, but the same principles can be applied to the entire watershed. So again, hopefully from this presentation, you've understood a little bit about the history of zoning, how common it is as a recreation management tool. I've walked you through some examples of zoning for other different parks and protected areas in terms of recreation use. We've talked a little bit about the questions we ask ourselves and the questions that managers are considering when we're figuring out where these zones are on the landscape. And then again, how we can combine different data sources to inform those zoning decisions and where those zones are, with an eye towards, again, trying to balance recreational use with some of our other managerial and our ecological objectives. So the last thing I want to end on is just that zoning feeds really well into, or you can go back one more slide, Brian, I'm sorry. Zoning can feed really well into adaptive management plans. You want to monitor how well those zones are working to meet those objectives and considerations. So it's not like you put the zones on the landscape and then you wash your hands of it and you're done. You need to come back in and monitor and make sure that that management action is working and the way those zones have been outlaid is working. So adaptive management is key regardless of the specific tool that you're using to achieve your management objectives. Now we can have some take-home messages and go on the next slide. Okay, because of an academic, I always end with some take-homes. So again, zoning is a common and successful recreation management tool. It really, and part of the reason it's successful is because it recognizes that diverse recreational opportunities can exist and coexist on a landscape, often while meeting those ecological and managerial objectives. And that, again, monitoring is still a key part of an adaptive management plan, regardless of what the management tool is, and zoning fits really nicely into that adaptive management framework. That's all I've got. I think I'll pass it back over to Alta or Sean at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. So we appreciate everyone that there was some frustration with the sticky notes. That wasn't, maybe the best exercise for some folks, and wasn't designed to not get your input. So what we can do, and to keep that going, because that is an important component of this entire process, is we do have another workshop in April. We'll do some summarizing of input to date that we've gathered. If you want to provide thoughts in the next step, which is going to be kind of public closing thoughts, you may. Otherwise, I will say in April, we'll have another opportunity to continue that discussion around zoning, because it will feed into some of the next parts of this planning process, and especially as we start bringing lots of other data together in terms of the watershed's actual biological resources, its map or trails, its roads, and we start layering all this information together. The zoning will start to kind of come out as a natural process for us to think about how we can balance these different uses and visitation types on the watershed while protecting the ecosystem and the water quality that we all to protect, and especially as a water district. So appreciate that it was a little clunky. Not everybody got the input they wanted to. Don't worry, it's not over. We'll continue to work on it. This process has been ongoing, right? We've had 5 public meetings to provide public opportunity for input. We're continuing to build on that input each meeting, and there will be more opportunities moving forward. So don't worry if you didn't get all of your thoughts in today, and we appreciate that might have been a little frustrating for some folks, and we'll work on that. So apologies for that. With that, the next meeting is going to be in April, and we're going to kind of move into allowing everyone to have some time to think about this. But there was a lot of great questions in the Q&A. We did see them. We're not going to spend time going through all of them. Some of them are fairly technical. They will be kind of written, and we'll incorporate those thoughts into the Watershed Survey report memo that will come out. We'll be bringing that forward hopefully by the next meeting in April. And so there will be an opportunity to see that, or we'll have it at our Watershed Committee meeting following that April meeting. So it will be available for review, and you can dig deeper into that data. The data that we presented tonight, though, just so you all kind of understand, was just the visitor survey that was collected on the watershed at all the major entrances. That was done so we can compare it to the 2012 report. And so that's what we wanted to show tonight. The other data will be incorporated into the memo. So with that, if you would like to raise your hand, we'll continue to have opportunities for input, and you can share your thoughts. We appreciate, again, that the sticky note wasn't the exercise for everyone, but feel free to voice your comments and input as you see fit. So give us a minute, and then Cole and Brian will call on folks, and we're giving you some time here, and we'll interrupt to move on, just because we do have a lot of people here tonight.
All right, thank you. I will try and call out people by name, and then if it's a phone number, I'm just going to use the last 4. So Francisco, hopefully you can grab them and unmute them from there. Looks like the first one that we have is the last 4 of 1402.
Yes, hello, James Holmes, Larkspur. I would just be interested in knowing whether or not having a zoning process would require additional administration and therefore administration costs. At last night's meeting of the district board, information was provided by financial staff about the district's dire financial condition, and also understaffing and deficits and revenue shortfalls, which will require increases in rates possibly, and specifically ranger shortfalls were highlighted by staff members, and anything that would require additional ranger staffing or administrative costs would seem to be difficult to reconcile with the district's current financial concerns and possible rate increases. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that comment.
Thank you. Next up is Roger Roberts.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I think there's a need to separate single track trails from roadways. The potential for conflict and use is a single track trail problem. And I'm one of the technologically challenged people, so I did not provide any input, but it's important that you recognize the need to protect sensitive habitat, and that would be for all users. And how are you going to separate that from the existing alignment of trails and roads that presently exist? Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Next one will be Bob Harlow.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay. So in a culture where, in a time when the pace of change is continually accelerating, things are getting faster and faster, and that's just the nature of life. But the pace of change in the culture is puts a great stress on all kinds of systems, from economic systems to natural systems, to psycho-personal, individual public health. In times like this, which we're in the middle of clearly, and it doesn't see any sense of changing, natural wildland is one of the most important resources that we can have for the collective communal sanity. So it's so important to be able to go into nature quietly, peacefully, with reverence. I've been hiking these trails for 37 years with often alone, sometimes in groups, and I don't intend to quit. It's very important, this alone time on the mountain. People need it more than they realize. And so as you go through these plans here, be careful to just not give away, too much of the natural solitude and beauty and the special quality of this water district. There are
Thank
plenty.
you, Bob. I think that's the time we've got allotted, so we appreciate that comment. It's an important one.
All right, Barbara Saltzman.
Yeah, thanks. I was also one of the technologically challenged, and I would appreciate if next time you do this, you would maybe give the directions a couple of more times, not just once in the beginning. That was not easy to follow. I would like to say that this should not be a matter of pulling in ecology. The ecology should be the basis of this whole effort. And I'm wondering if there should be an effort at all, to tell you the truth. This is not a park, it's a water district. It protects our water supply, and that should be the very basis upon whatever other uses are proposed and allowed. So I would say no new trails until it's proven that others could be that they are ecologically sound, and that other trails are closed in order to have minimum impact, and all social trails should be closed. And thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Appreciate the comment.
Looks like we have Patrick up next.
Hi, apologies. My baby's crying while I'm trying to feed him. I'd just like to thank Sean and the consultants for bringing us all together tonight. It's important to get the stakeholders together and see what plans are out there. The zoning plan seems a little capricious to me and expensive, and it's gonna be difficult to maintain. It's not gonna solve anything. We need to look to what we learned from the Santa Cruz workshop last week. I thought that was really, our last meeting was very productive. Highly recommend watching that meeting. It's time to open the mountain single track to bicycles in an equitable way. That means we all need to act like responsible adults, work together and share all the single track trails on different days or night. We have an active trail organization and trained volunteers that have a track record of improving erosion and safety at Tamarancho. That's A for B, and I'll just echo anything Vern and Tom Boss says tonight regarding the zoning plan. Myself and other fellow riders want to volunteer our time to improve the trails on the mountain, but the zoning plan would not motivate us. By the district partnering with bicycle volunteers to improve trails, we have more eyeballs out there and improve conservation outcomes, trust us. The data shows a big increase in bikes. The district can't afford to spend additional dollars on enforcement. The current system's unsustainable.
All right, I'm sorry, Patrick. Thanks for the comments. We appreciate it.
All right, next up will be Jonathan Braun.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure to emphasize that I think it's important for the water district and you consultants to use historic and existing behaviors by various users to inform your planning, any future changes in the watershed. I would make the observation that on the part of the bicycle users, there's complete and widespread disregard for the posted adopted speed limits. There's many cases of illegal riding on single track trails. The long history of illegal trail building in the wilderness of the watershed. And even though motorized vehicles are prohibited in the watershed, you see many electrified bicycles there. So I would keep in mind the lack of compliance with the existing rules.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate the comment.
All right, next up is Bob Milstead.
Okay, with just a minute, let me get right to the point. As interesting as the zoning discussion was, it seems to me that the survey and the discussion is missing the threshold point, which is, are any of the trails and fire roads overcrowded to the point where we need further regulation? In asking for priorities, there were 4 of them listed in the survey. None of them was, should we just leave well enough alone? I think rather than, an extensive consultant's report with everything we heard about, what we need is for the people who actually use this mountain to sit down and in good faith work out which trails ought to have what kind of use to it, bearing in mind that hikers already have 60 miles of exclusive use of trails. Bikers have none. We share the roads. And before any further restrictions are placed on us, there ought to be a showing of that there's a safety problem or an environmental problem. We've been at this for 5 years and nobody has established by data that there are any problems that require further regulation or further restrictions on bicycle usage. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bob. Next up is Nate McKitterick.
Thank you for the presentation tonight. It was very informative. I just wanted to say that I'm sure we can all get along on the trails and in the watershed, but if we're going to go through this process, we have to be honest about the science. And there are multiple studies showing that biking on existing trails doesn't have any greater environmental impact than hiking. And in fact, users who come to the watershed in a car have entirely greater impacts due to the need to construct and maintain roads, parking lots, as well as law enforcement and greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to be honest about what the science is when we're talking about this. I also think it's important, the part of the presentation talking about what's wilderness and what's not. This is not wilderness. And when people talk like it is, we have to go back to the planning principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nate. Appreciate the comment.
All right, next up we have Nona Dennis.
Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I want to say that probably the most revealing maps for those that show where there are areas of highest concentration at around about half a dozen access points. What is reassuring and important is to note the vast, large areas of the water district, of the watershed, that are free of concentration now. Those should be the focus of careful attention and management so that they remain remote, remain little used, and are really set aside as a kind of wilderness, because there are wildernesses. They should have the big attention. We'll have to deal with how to deal with the congestion at those areas of concentration. They also need special attention to keep them from degrading any further. Thank you.
Appreciate the comment, Nona.
All right, next up we have Matthew Morato.
Hello. I find the zoning approach a really interesting way to balance the needs of our watershed, which are really diverse. But I also think that there's also a pretty practical approach that just revolves around expanding trail access to those who currently are represented in watershed usage. And while the zoning approach would be a good way to sort of implement that along with other measures, it's important to note that the current status isn't working for large portions of users. And by balancing the watershed's purpose as well as ecological goals, along with these recreational activities, hopefully a more equitable and inclusive watershed can work for people of all ages and all user groups. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Appreciate the comment.
All right, next up we have Lisa.
Lisa, you might need to unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yep,
there you
we
go.
can hear you.
Yes, yeah, my wife and I, we have a small hiking and bicycle rental company. And I'd just like to thank the people of Marin County and the Water District for helping us try to open this resource up. Every month, we get hundreds of people calling up wanting to go to the birthplace of the mountain bike. And I think it's really wonderful that you're willing to open this up to everyone and have us all share in this beautiful bounty we have in Marin County. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the comment.
Thank you. Next up is Jamie Mackey.
Hi, I've got two short comments. One is I wonder, at some point it was mentioned earlier in the presentation, but I wonder if part of an approach could be to open the watershed up more for nighttime use, and that would filter off some portion of the user group, especially mountain bikers. I don't know how much that's been considered. My other comment is I'm very leery of the recreational zones. In all the other parts of the country I've lived in, I think if that topic came up, I would have been all for it. I'm worried about it, particularly in Marin County, just because of the historical exclusion of user groups. And that's really all my comment. Done.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Jamie. Thanks for the comment.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Nathan Cohn.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I am a little bit leery of the zones as well, although I believe if there was a good faith effort to truly, target sensitive species and use logic for sensitive areas for water quality, it could be a very nice way of kind of seeing the places that all users need to avoid, since especially bikes and hikers have the same impact. And then I just want to, caution folks from making assumptions about certain user groups. There's some mountain bikers have ridden off trail, but there's a whole lot of hiking and walking that happens off trails as well. Hikers aren't necessarily quiet. These are kind of getting into some stereotypes and that kind of stuff. So just trying to keep to the science and to practicality and to the mission to provide water, to provide recreation, and to preserve an awesome, very fun resource that we should all be excited to be able to take part in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan.
Next up is Joby.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to hear our concerns. The vast majority of the mountain bikers in Marin County are very respectful of not only other users, but especially respectful of the land. And all any of us are asking for is the opportunity to share in the bounty that we have here and to have a just usage that we can all have a wonderful time using the mountain and a wonderful time protecting the side of the mountain. And frankly, a wonderful time protecting and doing the maintenance that we're all willing to volunteer on. for too long, one user group has either via lawsuits or threats of lawsuits commanded the way that the mountain would be used. It's time for all users to have equitable access to the mountain and for a realistic go forward plan to be used for the mountain. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment.
All right, next up we have Chris Tufts.
All right. Well, Joby kind of stepped on a little bit of what I had to say because it's exactly right. But I just wanted to reflag that a new recreation plan can and should tap into the community's notable resources around cycling's immense volunteer trail building and maintenance community. Just in light of both, the idea of potentially expanding use, any proposed zoning, and also the water district's budget. I think that the water district should also leverage low-cost technologies, try and make access more equitable in recognition of just a trend of increasing cycling usage. And also want to recognize that, as I think about the survey methods and as I personally experience them, with a preference, it felt like for in-person collection heavily favors the status quo. And I want to, just ask the water district and the consultants to contemplate, how to account for the unheard voices in the broader community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
All right, next we have Emily Mulholland.
Okay, thank you. It's Emil Mulholland. So a couple comments. One is that I work with a lot of youth, and zones could accidentally disenfranchise people that don't drive cars. If a habitat area covers a large enough area, you could have poor access for everything that a kid can reach from their house, and that's just a little pitfall we should avoid. Other thing is this data seems to cover like a snapshot in time, and it would be great if it covered a more historic ecosystem perspective. We definitely want to be aware of what we can get back in the watershed through restoration. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for mispronunciation there. Larry Minkus is next. Sorry, I probably butchered that as well.
You did fine. Minicus, yes,
Minicus.
Thank you. And when we're talking about sharing, let's remember it's not sharing between humans that we have to focus on. It's sharing with wildlife. Humans have wants and desires, but wildlife has needs, and that has to be the focus here. What was not touched upon tonight are wildlife corridors, and those have to be at the front first and foremost. And I want to say something about zoning. Zoning sounds like an idea that we should explore more deeply, but I think about Phoenix Lake, and I cannot think of any way that you can zone Phoenix Lake appropriately. It's one of the most crowded areas according to the survey, and I don't see a practical solution there. So I'd like to know how zoning would work there. And it's important to note that in the survey, we're looking at nearly 3-to-1 foot to wheel. So having 60 miles of trails specifically for all of us, including us bikers, to be on wheel, to be on foot, should remain available because those on foot want to be separated from other faster moving types. And I also want to say that when studies are conducted, all these studies state exactly the same things in their conclusion. Do not draw conclusions from our studies because our study is site specific. To learn more, each study must be done site specifically. So whatever a study showed up in Colorado or in
Thank
DC,
you, Larry. I got to interrupt you. We appreciate
thank
your
you so
comment,
much.
Though. Yeah, thank you.
All right, looks like the next one is eco-informatics and climate solutions.
Hi, yeah, sorry, can you hear me? This is Megan Elrod. Couldn't change the name on my profile. I am a biologist, and I am also a mountain bike rider on single track trails in Marin water lands in the county. And I just like to state that stressors for wildlife are much larger than what we're talking about here, and include like land use changes and the large scale management practices on the watershed. And that's the lens we need to look through. And I appreciate that the Marin water has invested time and money into tracking the wildlife populations on these lands. And it's important that this data is utilized when deciding how to manage and to rely on the studies and not anecdotes of what certain user groups do or do not use to point fingers. Education and outreach is the important thing here, and providing well-maintained trails for users will do more than attempting to limit use, which cannot be or is too costly to be enforced. And mountain bikes are a willing and able user group. Thanks so much for the time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, next up we have Finn Sumrall.
All right, so I just want to thank all you guys for hosting this, and I'm going to go back to something that Ashley said on her slide, which is to provide, the goal of ROS is to provide opportunities for visitors to participate in preferred activities in the appropriate physical, social, and managerial settings. As such, visitors may fulfill their motivations and realize benefits. Right now, mountain bikers, like no single track on Mount Tam or the Watershed, and fulfilling our motivations to ride awesome trails is pretty hard to do legally. And so historically, there has been lots of citations and bad kind of press for mountain bikers. So providing opportunities for visitors to participate in preferred activities. And whether that's through existing trails like social trails and making them environmentally sound to ride, and just opening those up doesn't necessarily have to be by building new trails. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Finn. Appreciate it.
All right, next up we have Terry Thomas.
Good evening. I have 4 points. Hopefully I can get through these. First, I want to thank Ashley for all the examples. It was really very helpful. And I wanted to call your attention to the example at Yosemite where they had a heat map of the visitors, but they also had a heat map of the ecology and the sensitive grasses that they wanted to protect. We haven't had that here. We have not gotten a heat map, and clearly the mountain is much more complicated than that to see how we're going to overlay these uses onto the ecology. The second is the issue of carrying capacity and the idea of overcrowding on some of those trails and how we might address criteria for overcrowding. There used to be the visitor experience resource protection model that helped with that, and I'd like to know more about that. The third is, were the non-system trails included in all of those trails that you listed? Because I think they have a different, unique set of issues and criterias, including fragmentation. And the fourth is the enforcement issue. And we can't enforce things very well now, and there's no money for the future. And I'll go. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Next up is Linda Novi.
Thank you very much for today. I have to say I like the idea of ecological zones and how we can protect them. I think it's time to stop using the word users. We need a land ethic that honors the preservation of the mountain's wildlife and flora and water, and where we all see ourselves as respectful visitors. And hopefully hikers and horse people and hopefully bike riders could come together in projects to close non-authorized trails. There was an example of temporal use and closing a certain, one of the examples Ashley gave, a certain area to nighttime use. And really, the MMWD needs to be closed at night, and people need to honor that. And lastly, I'm an equestrian. There's low numbers of riders on the mountain because many riders are not comfortable to ride on the trails because they're constantly ridden on by mountain bikers who ride fast, and it's dangerous. So those are my comments. Thank you again for today.
Appreciate it, Linda.
All right, next up we have Rachel Lloyd.
Hey there, thank you. I would just like to say, can you hear me?
Yep.
No.
Oh, I unmuted. Look,
Oh, yeah, we can hear
No,
you.
you're good. You're good, Rachel.
I. All right, can you hear me?
Right.
Yeah, you're good.
I'll be quick. Thank you so much for this. I'm impressed with your specialist on recreation management and her presentation. Listening to Ashley, we hear how everywhere else in the country, folks are able to work together to create sustainable trail use for all people. We can and should be able to manage our watershed in an equitable and non-discriminatory way. I like being out in nature, and this is a beautiful resource we have, and we can do this. We don't have to exclude anyone. We can all work together. We can have trails for people doing whatever they feel like they need to do separate. That's an option, or we can all use the same trails. Thank you.
Appreciate the comment.
Next up is Sammy O.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
So at the beginning of tonight, we heard Sean Horn say something that was compromise is essential for Marin Municipal Water District to move forward on this process. And I 100% agree. I want to also point out that 87% of people rated the trail conditions as great or good. So if we're willing to compromise, and if we want to enforce zones where there can be less traffic in order to preserve our watershed, that's fine. The hikers, the non-bikers need to compromise, and they need to, give some of that trail time up to bikers. That way we can all come to a compromise and make sure, whether it's through designated times or off and on days, that everyone gets to access the watershed and that no one's left out and that the watershed is preserved.
Appreciate the comment, Sammy.
All right, next up we have Elena Ochoa.
Okay, here I am. I unfortunately found out about this process late, so was not in on the past workshops, but I just wonder, shouldn't Marin Water be starting with, these are the areas of ecological concern, so our zones that we are in this process with the public about are here, here, and here, so that it's not quite such an open book. I mean, we have so few wildlands and natural spaces for habitat, and in the Bay Area, we're very lucky to have what we have. And I believe that should be a number one. I do like the process of seeing where different recreational activities happen. It doesn't sound like there's money for enforcement. And so I really fear that there would be a free-for-all. And I think Marin Water would do well to try to organize kind of citizen groups to work together to provide enforcement. As a community, we all love this resource. And I think that maybe should be the next step in this whole process, is bringing the community in to be active stewards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. Appreciate them.
All right, next up we have Brian Walsh.
You got me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for everybody speaking. I just noting the data that it was offered, it seems as if the majority of users are hiking and they're older. And to avoid conflict with riders, I think it's a good idea. According to Ashley D'Antonio's, one of her statements was the separation of trails for riding and biking. And just look at the vertical topography here and where people are parking, as you demonstrated in your illustration. The hikers are hiking up the mountain. Riders will probably take the fire roads up and then come down. So you've got a conflict created right there. So separating the trails seems like a good idea. Thank you.
Thanks for the comment, Brian.
You're welcome.
Next, we have Sam Luke.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I looked at, I want to provide some feedback on the survey. I appreciate the effort. I personally had a really hard time kind of answering it. I feel like a lot of people use the watershed in dynamic ways, maybe more than one destination, more than one use. And I tried really hard, but I really didn't feel like it captured, the way I use the watershed, and maybe many others as well. So I hope there's some more effort, I guess, to gather more data. And someone made a mention of this earlier too, but it's really important, I think, in this effort to kind of extend the net beyond the status quo, if that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Yeah, appreciate it, Sam.
All right, next up is Taylor.
Yes, hi, thank you for having us. My points are just that the consensus or concept of wilderness zoning might not exactly pertain to MMWD. However, I think that there could be ways to scale that zoning to fit MMWD based on higher access in congested areas. The thing about it is that there is substantial infrastructure already in place, be it fire roads or processing plants and even dams that already exist on this quote unquote wilderness. The status quo has been such that a certain demographic has had full access to these lands, while others, such as mountain bikers, have been set aside. Bikers offer a unique, low-impact means of reaching more wild forests areas, as Ashley described, that if access is allowed, would dissipate congestion and possibility of conflict. Otherwise, further zoning protocols could include seasonal closures or odd or even calendar day closures that I have seen work for state parks and land preserves I've worked for in Washington State. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it, Taylor.
All right, next up is Jeff Guild.
Good evening. Thanks for the presentation and the collaborative effort here. The survey results were interesting, and the zoning presentation opened my eyes to the kind of different ways we could zone things. So I'm not necessarily or categorically opposed to the zoning, but I do want to say one thing about zoning. The techniques, they really need to be simple. They need to be easy to understand. They need to be inclusive and fair. And I think if you do that, if they're those things, then it'll be easy to enforce. I think the enforcement problem that people are talking about isn't a symptom of bad people. I think it's a symptom of bad policy in the status quo. I think if we have the equitable access for all the user groups, two things will happen. We'll have enforcement requirements, they'll be lessened, and then we'll have increase in stewardship and volunteerism as resources for protecting the ecology and keeping the watershed pristine. And that just the status quo isn't serving anyone well right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We appreciate that.
All right, next up is Will Shore. And Will, you might need to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
So a lot of good thoughts. I'm not really into zoning because it just seems like a lot's going to be wasted in funds and time, and we'll end up probably only benefiting one group. My main concern at this point, after riding 40 years in the county, since I was a little kid, all over the county, on illegal trails and illegal trails, which I no longer ride, I would like to see access for pedal assist e-bikes that don't have a throttle and are under a 20-mile-per-hour limit. Been riding these bikes for 8 years in the county. I've done no extra damage to anything. No birds were hurt, no bugs were trampled, no more damage than riding a normal bike. And this bike, at this stage, these bikes are getting more and more quiet, and they allow access for people that can't just ride up hills anymore. 50 years old, I enjoy riding mountain bikes, but I much prefer it with a little assist. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Will. Thank you.
And then next is Win Gilligan. I'm sorry for pronunciation.
Win Gilliland, very close.
Thank you.
So I admittedly came into this meeting pretty skeptical of the idea of zoning, thinking that it would be just another tool to restrict access to mountain bikes, which are already the most restricted user group. But I thought Ashley's presentation was fantastic and it opened my mind. And I think it showed that zoning could potentially be an effective part of a recreational management strategy. But regardless, I mean, I think the most important thing is to have a recreation management strategy that recognizes the reality that mountain bikers are using the mountain. And if we don't manage that recreation, we're going to have bad ecological outcomes. We're going to spend a fortune on enforcement, and we're going to have user conflict. And that's on land management. Like, we have to manage that recreation, recognize that reality. And I appreciate the efforts that this group is doing to do just that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Win.
All right. Next up, we have Bill Keene.
Can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I want to just commend Marin Water for actually doing this rec management plan. It's long overdue. I've lived in Marin County almost my entire adult life, and I've seen actually my entire life, born and raised in Marin. A couple things that I've heard tonight. I used to manage the open space district in Sonoma County for 13 years. Everything was multi-use and we didn't have conflict up there. I recognize that Marin's a different place and there's been conflict that's been going on a long time, but we have very simple solutions that you've heard about from the folks from Santa Cruz in a previous meeting, from Ashley tonight, and you're hearing it from the mountain bike community for certain. We just got to share the resource. I mean, it's long time and long overdue for mountain bikers to have access to single track trails. We can convert social trails like the Paradigm Trail, or even some that are on the mountain like Northside, and just get it done. Let's do it. Let's do it now. And I support the board in doing that.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate the comment.
Okay, and next up is Bill.
I guess I had to unmute myself. I say I've lived here all my life. Phoenix Lake has been my backyard. And I wanted to point out that what we are in the watershed are visitors. We coexist with the local wildlife. They live there. And we really are an impact to them, but we don't have to be a negative impact. And I think we do have to realize that that we're in a visiting area. And there's a strong tradition in the Water District. It's not a park. It has been a visitor's area, an area of discovery. And I think part of the real solution is an education and the fostering of that tradition. Zoning is a model, and I think it would be very interesting as a measurement device, but it does have limitations because of its construct. And I think parking is a reasonable, natural, limiting access model that can help regulate, and further volunteer support, boom pulling, trail support, and trail repair, I think should be emphasized. Thank you very much, and I do appreciate your effort.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill.
All right, next up we have Tracy McDermott.
Okay, got it? Am I there?
You're there.
Okay. I'm 73. I've ridden my horse on Mount Tam for close to 50 years. And there is not today a single track trail on Tam or MMWD that does not have bike tracks all over it. So all this stuff I'm hearing about, oh, we're so restricted. I'm sorry, but you're all over the place. I have yet to ride a single track trail that I'm not run into by a bike, like today, the two bikes that came up behind me. Second, are the ratepayers going to be paying for all this recreation? That's my problem. These guys aren't from here, many of them. The third thing, you have no data on collision or accidents caused by or in part by bicycles or bikes going over the side. There's nothing about the injuries or the accidents or the damage that happens. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy.
All right, and the next one we have is on the phone. Last four are 8800.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'd like to point out that in the East Bay Municipal Utility District does not allow bikers on its lands. And so, and if you are going to hike, you have to get a permit. And, they're taking good care of their resources over there. And we really need to realize that we need to have respect for the nature and the habitat. And it's, nobody likes to be, have somebody following behind them, breathing down their neck. And when you have a hiker on a single track trail and you want to stop and look at a bird or you want to look at wildlife and you're being mowed over by a bicyclist, it's rather disturbing. So I think that, we've got an epidemic of bullying in the local schools, and the cyclists often ride faster than they realize. And we've got a lot of road riders who are scofflaws. They don't care about the habitat, and they'll never get caught. And we really need to address some of those issues because we all have to share the watershed and we don't have to exclude anyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next up is Tom Boss.
Good evening, everybody. And just want to thank Sean, staff, and consultants for this presentation. Really good news, in my opinion, on the survey front. People feel safe and are enjoying the trails. And those numbers are up from the last time we did this survey. So I think that reinforces my personal thoughts that we're doing some good work out there to maintain the trails, to educate people, to make people play nice, play together. And thanks, Ashley, for the presentation on zoning. I found some of the information aligned with some of the things that I believe in, acknowledging historical trends, respecting other users, ways that we can decrease conflict and direct traffic away from congested areas, and potentially reducing costs and avoiding impacts to others. I just want to point out lots of people here in this meeting are already doing good work, trail work, helping find the funding, doing education. And I think the development of an ambassador program would be excellent to assist visitors and point out hazards. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom.
All right, next up is Bill Albright.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can.
I appreciate your presentation tonight. And my remarks are that all fire roads should be available to all mountain bikes, e-bikes included, and that we should try to learn to share rather than exclude new users. There may be some trails in which all users may be able to coexist. Bikes and hikers may use alternate days or alternate routes to enjoy the watershed. And I think we need to recognize a changing user pattern and include all new user groups in enjoying our watershed. A positive outcome for that is that MMWD will have more eyes on the land by people who really care about it. Oddly, wildlife seems attached to where people congregate. It's a curious thing. I'm a birder and a naturalist, but I find more wildlife where I go than out in the wild. We need to learn to share. And there are no congested areas that are not accessed by cars and parking lots. So bikes are an excellent way to go. And I think we need to see users as an asset to public safety and watershed overview.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate the comments.
All right. Jamie, Mackie, I think you've already gone. We might skip to some other people who haven't had a chance to give a comment yet. So David Long, go with you, and Jamie, if you want to tack on at the end, then feel free to do so if you'd like. All right, and David Long, might need to unmute yourself on your end.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. We've heard nothing about two issues that I think are very important. And they have to do with the preservation of the environment on the watershed. One is plant diseases, and the other is invasive plants. And people on the mountain, whether they're hikers or bikers or cars, are vectors for both of those. And the high use areas have not been treated all that well in some respects. We have a lot of degradation, we have a lot of disease, we have a lot of invasive plants. And if you look 50 years ahead, it doesn't look pretty if we provide the same level of access to the remote areas of the watershed. And so it's for those two reasons alone, it's really important to keep the remote areas remote, because that's the only thing that's basically the only thing that's protecting them from degradation.
Thank you, David. Appreciate the comments.
Next up is Rob Parno.
I just want to thank you guys for putting on this presentation. And earlier, the recreation zoning discussion was eye-opening. I think one of the main points that I want to cover is when Ashley mentioned that there was no issues where she's at with people breaking the rules. And I think that's a representation of equal access, right? People are only breaking the rules because they don't have access, especially in the mountain biking community. So if you provide people with access, I think there'll be a lot of self-policing. And as several other people have mentioned, right, you have a huge network of advocates who want to preserve the environment. They want to work on trails. They want to support biodiversity, and tapping into that by providing people access, providing people opportunity to do trail work and to expand usage and opportunities will really foster the ability for the watershed to kind of reduce the policing that they have to do.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate the comment.
Next up is Isabel Froner.
Hey, huge thanks to Sean for putting this on. Something I'd like to throw out there is that there have been a lot of concerns expressed regarding the speed of mountain bikers on fire roads. Fire roads are steep, they're graded, they're slippery. It kind of forces us into a position of speed, even when we are huge advocates of, the whole slow and say hello movement. As a high school mountain bike alumnus and coach, the thing that enables our high school riders to ride in control and ride responsibly is single track trails. We are a huge untapped volunteer workforce in building and maintaining those trails. If you give us a job to do, we will show up and do it. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. Appreciate the comment.
And next up is Linda B.
Hi, I just have 3 short points I'd like to make. One is that I can't understand how policy can be enforced with increased visitorship when I don't see it being enforced now. The second one is I think all visitors need to feel safe when they're turning a corner on any trail. I don't think that's the case now. And I also would like to see an EIR. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Douglas Ullman.
Hi, my name is Laura Ullman. I want to agree with the last speaker. I've been hiking on the mountain for 45 years. It's in my backyard. I'm deeply concerned about my own safety, having almost been hit multiple times by 4 mountain bikers coming off of the single track trail over my head. They would have wound up right on top of me had I been 3 seconds behind where I was. So, and that's just one of many confrontations that have almost wiped me out. Other ones have occurred on the Matt Davis Trail coming off the Hukuiku, and there is no enforcement. And these people think that they can just run roughshod. There is no enforcement. There's no protection for wildlife, and I don't see it getting any better. And so all the access issues that they're claiming are false.
Thank you for the comment.
And next up, we're going to go with Rowan Metzler.
Hello everybody. So I'm a high school mountain biker. So I'm gonna get straight to the point. We are probably the largest kind of untapped workforce. We do a ton of trail work on the Tamarancho trail system, and we are totally willing to be out there maintaining these trails, making sure we're not encroaching on wildlife, whatever. We will be out there doing the work. We need a place to train. Like, we have a huge talent pool, all these incredible riders, and currently fire roads aren't safe for us to train on. You know, as Izzy said, they're slippery, they're steep, they're just a bad place to ride. People crash, incidents happen. You know, it can be hard to, just bad things happen when you have lots of people on fire roads and people can't control their speed. Yeah, that's it.
All right, thank you very much for the comment. Appreciate it. So thank you, everyone. I think we got through all the comments, and we appreciate everyone's thoughts and input and the process. Acknowledging that we had a little hiccup with our technology tonight and our post-it board, so we'll kind of go back to the drawing table and work on that to get some additional input on the thoughts that folks have around zoning. It's definitely a strong tool, as Ashley demonstrated in her presentation, and used by lots of land managers, including Marin Water currently. It's a great way for us to think about how we might be able to balance priorities and think about different ways of visitation and protection of natural resources. So that's why I wanted to bring it forward, just to review and think through. And it's a guiding principle in a planning document. It in and of itself doesn't require a significant amount of resources, but it helps us think about our landscape and think about prioritizing different types of management for different areas. So that's a key piece of it. So next meeting, we will be bringing forward some of that biological data that people are asking about and wanting to see. We've been working kind of high level through this process, stepping through the different topics and subjects, and we're going to start layering on the Strava data and our visitor patterns with our biological data and our trails to really understand where opportunities exist for protecting natural resources better and where opportunities might exist for reducing conflict in terms of congested areas or potential conflict from trail usage and fire road usage. So that's the intention, and we'll be bringing an update at the March Watershed Committee, as I mentioned, and we'll try to clarify things that are outstanding and where we're going with this process next. So again, we appreciate everyone's time tonight, and thank you, Ashley, for a great presentation, and Alta for bringing forward the data that we've collected on the watershed from visitor usage. I think we got up to 168 people tonight. I think that's the most people we've had in the meeting thus far. So thanks everyone for your energy, attendance, and patience with us as we work through this. Have a good night.